For Parshas Noach, Rabbi Simcha, in his opening presentation, notices that there's a discrepancy between the description of Noach at the beginning of the parsha and that which appears a little bit later. And we'll understand this discrepancy in just a minute. First, let's notice that the Torah calls Noach Tzaddik Tamim B'Dorosav. And the word Dorosav is in the plural. And Rabbi Simcha, quoting a Gemara in Avodah Zarah, says that B'Dorosav Lashon Rabim is a reference to Shnei Doros. There's the Dar before the Mabul and the Dar after the Mabul. Noach spans both generations. And the Gemara tells us that there's a difference between Tamim and Tzaddik. Tamim, the Gemara says, is B'drachav, and Tzaddik is B'masav. Rashi there in Avodah Zarah and Daf Vav, in explaining what the Chazal meant when they said Tamim B'drachav, Rashi says Anav Ushfal Ruach. So that the word Tamim, which the Gemara identifies as B'drachav in the ways of his life, the way he behaves, is a reference to a moral attribute of humility. Tzaddik, on the other hand, Rashi identifies as below Chamas. Chamas is a generic term that includes within it all different forms of thievery and stealing. And in this context, Noach is described, as a tzaddik, in contrast to his generation. His generation was totally guilty and polluted with the violation of Chamas, and he, in contrast, Noach was a tzaddik, below Chamas. He wasn't in any way partner to or party to any of these types of violations or crimes. In that sense, he was a tzaddik, below Chamas. Says Rabbi Simcha, again, Adkan, up until this point, Rabbi Simcha hasn't added anything. He's just quoting the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, pointing out Dorosav as referring to the two generations, one before the Mabul and the other after, and quoting Rashi to explain the difference between Tamim and Tzaddik. Tamim, reflective of his midos, and B'Dorosav, Tzaddik reflecting his maisim, his actions, his guiltless behavior in the area of Ben Adam L'Chavero and stealing and so forth, and Tamim, a reflection of his midos, of his midah of Anova. Here's where Rabbi Simcha wants to add something. And he says the following, that Hine bidar shelifnei hamabul haya malaso shahaya below chamos. If you talk about B'Dorosav as referring to first and foremost the door of the Mabul, then Noach excels in relationship to his door, which is a door of Chamas, as being a tzaddik below Chamas. So the word tzaddik refers to the comparison or the contrast between Noach and the Dor HaMabul. Haya malaso shahaya below Chamas. He was without any thievery. Shekulam hayu chomsim ushtufim by rayos. Here, Rabbi Simcha adds another element. Rashi, at the beginning of our parsha of Noach, says ki yishchis kol basar star kol haaretz refers to arayos. So the generation of Noach was Nogua. They were also guilty of Arayos, and Noach was a Tzaddik, both in conscious with Chamos and Arayos. Vahulo, but he was free and innocent of those kinds of violations. Now Rabbi Simcha presents a thesis, which is, again, highly questionable, but this is his opinion, that man after the Mabul is not the same as man before the Mabul. And therefore, the word Tzaddik would not be sufficient to describe the greatness of Noach after the Mabul. Because in this new world order after the Mabul of this generation post-Mabul, Hayukulam Gidurim Me'arayos Uprushim Michamos. That now the post-Mabul generation was on a greater level than before. They had rectified and redeemed themselves of these two violations of Chamos and Arayos. So how can the Torah now in the post-Mabul generation project the greatness of Noach in his relationship vis-a-vis the members of this new generation? To describe him as a tzaddik would certainly not suffice, because tzaddik is indicative of the fact that he avoided these violations, which now the generation is avoiding. Omnam tamim, but if you describe him as a tamim, meaning anav v'shval ruach, then we understand why this description of Noach is so appropriate post-Mabul. And Noach excels during the time of the Mabul in his manifestation of these two attributes of Anav Ushval Ruach. And in this case, Bidoro, in his original first generation, meaning the generation of the Mabul, Ein Chashivus. No one would pay any attention to Noach's greatness. As far as his being a tzaddik is concerned, well, they weren't interested in avoiding these violations. As far as being a tamim is concerned, it didn't make any impact on them. Who cares about Noach's humility? It was totally not on their radar screen. Avol yachar Mabul, now when Noach comes out of the Teva, now we can talk about Noach in a whole new light. Shenishar levado, Noach in the Teva is alone. He has separated himself from the rest of the generation. And who's talking to Noach? Noach has now been elected to be the person that's saved from the Mabul, from the entire generation. Wow, he's great. Not only that, Hashem diber imo. God communicates directly with Noach. Ubircho v'itzilo, and he blessed him and saved him. So at this point in Noach's career, he can give himself a pat on the shoulders and be uplifted in his self-image as a great God. I mean, he's alone, he's separated from the generation, he's the only one who's saved. He is the one who is going to have an election by God with communication in a direct way, and God saves him. And Noach proves himself to be just the opposite. Instead of boasting, instead of letting it get to his head about how great he is, on the contrary, Noach manifests a different behavior pattern. He spends all those long days and months in the Teva. What's he doing in the Teva? He gives himself over. He's totally dedicated as a servant of God to take care of all the creatures inside the Teva. Chazal go into great detail about how difficult it was. Noah could have said, well, I'm the great one that was chosen by God. I don't have to put my feet in the mud and get dirty with all this kind of stuff and take care of the animals with such love and compassion. No, he reflects this midah of shfal ruach. And the Bedorosov now tells me that even if compared to the Dor of the Mabul, he's called a Tzaddik because he is not involved in those terrible violations and immorality. But in the second Dor of Bedorosov, now what comes to fore, what expresses itself is Noach's Tamim as an Anav Ushfal Ruach. Lo Hayam Miskah. He could have let it get to his head. He could have been conceited about it, but he wasn't. Us, now, the entire universe could recognize this second appellation, the second description of Noach as a Tamim. Us Hayanechshav, it was considered very chashuv to the whole world because he sustained the world, because of his midah of anivus. And now, Rabbi Simcha, to top it off, he says, Lachein Amar, therefore the Torah says the following, that Kioschara isi tzaddik lefanai b'dor hazeh, when the Kadosh Baruch Hu is comparing Noach to his generation, the generation of the deluge, God calls him a tzaddik. No mention of Tamim. But when Noach comes out of the Teva, God says to him, you are a tzaddik Tamim, because now you are shining forth in your midah anava as a result of your treatment of the animals in the Teva. So as far as mentioning the word Tamim to describe Noach before the Teva, before the deluge, that doesn't make any sense. Tamim is out of place. Nobody saw or gained or benefited from his tmimus, but he was a tzaddik, and God chose him and elected him because he was tzaddik. He was guiltless of all those terrible violations. But after the Mabul, in the second generation, Bidorosov has the emphasis now on Tamim, because now Noach has saved the entire world through his midah of tmimus. And that's what Rabbi Simcha presents here in his understanding of the Torah. So let me just get out, what I forgot to do is get out a Chumash. That's important to have a Chumash open. And we're going to go on to the second piece in Parshas Noach, which you'll see in Pasuk Chaf Aleph. And this is a description of Noach in the Teva. Now, in order to appreciate this second presentation on Pasuk Chaf Aleph, we need to understand a little bit about what bothers Reb Meir Simcha. And as we've seen over and over again in his method, he doesn't tell you what his problem is. The Torah uses a very interesting phrase which appears elsewhere in the Torah, here in Parshas Noach, and again in Sefer Vayikra. The Torah says that V'ato kach lecha mikol machal asher yochel. Let me just get it again inside. 1 second. Where is it? Okay. Now, if we open up the Chumash, Vayikra, Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Lamed Dalet, there too, it says in a totally different context, Mikol ha'ochel asher ye'ochel. And Rabbi Meir Simcha wants to know, it's not coincidental, he thinks, that the same expression is used in two places, in two contexts. So in order to shed a new light on our pasuk, he quotes Rabbi Shimon, the Tana, from Chulin Daf Kuf Chaf Tes, who interprets that pasuk of Vayikra Yud Aleph Mikola Ochel Asher Ye'ochel. And Rabbi Shimon adds, what does it mean Ochel Shata Yochel? What does it mean Ochel Shata Asher Yochel? It means Ochel Shata Yochel Lachilo La'acher. And that's another way of saying Ochel that's mutter b'hana. So let's give a little bit of a background here. The Mishnah at the end of Masechta Chulin tells us that if you have something that's Osir b'hana, you're not allowed to benefit from it, then it's tar. It's not metame tumas ochel. In other words, it doesn't have a shame ochel. And only that which has a shame ochel can receive tumah. So if Shimon says that something that's osir b'hana is not subject to Kabbalah's tumah. The Gemara asks my time with Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon quotes the pasuk Mikola ochel asher ye'ochel in the parsha of Tumas Ochlin. It says ochel asher ye'ochel, and Rabbi Shimon interprets that to mean that ochel shata yochel lachilo lacherim. If there's food that you're allowed to give to a guy, even though you're not allowed to eat it, or you're allowed to feed it to your dog, kari ochel. As far as Tumas Ochlin is concerned, then you're not allowed to give it. As far as Tumas Ochlin is concerned, if you have ochel which you're not allowed to give to a guy, then it's not considered ochel asher yochel that ata yochel lachilo lacher. And based on this, Rabbi Shimon excludes Avram and Achai from Kabbalah's tumah, because Avram and Achai is also both to a Jew and to a Ben Noach, and therefore you cannot be machil Avram and Achai lacher, and therefore it's not called ochel. What does that have to do with Hashem's charge to Noach? Says Rabbi Meir Simcha, v'rak lebehemos hefker mutter, v'lo nene v'lo midi. He says that the only animal that you'd be allowed to feed in the case of Isurei Hana, for example, let's say Avram and Achai, would only be an animal that's ownerless. Because if you own the animal and I feed your animal something that's also b'hana, which according to Rav Shimon, Avram and Achai, since it's also b'hana, I can't feed it to your animal, I'm doing you a favor, and you owe me one in return. But if it's a behemoth hefker, then it's mutter. V'lo nene v'lo midi, because this animal is hefker, it's not yours. You see, if you own an animal, then you're obligated to feed the animal. And if so, by feeding the animal, you get benefit because you're fulfilling your obligation. So let's say if Avram and Achai was also b'hana, I could feed it to a dog that's hefker, but I wouldn't be able to feed it to my own dog because I would be fulfilling my obligation, which is called mizonoseim alehem, that I'm obligated to feed my animal. But in the case of a famous hefker, I don't have any responsibility to feed this animal. And therefore, if I give Isurei Hana to the animal, I don't violate any Isur. Lachen, boy dafka machal asher ye'achel. In other words, what the Torah is telling Noach is that take into the teva only food that's mutar b'ana. Something which is asur b'ana, leave it out. Why? Because you're responsible to feed the animals in the teva. And when you're responsible to feed the animals in the teva, then by feeding them isuri adna, you would be violating that prohibition. Even though you might argue, well, all the animals are ownerless, and therefore each one is hefker. So why is Noach enjoined from feeding them isuri adna? Why did the Torah stipulate mikol machal asher ye'achel, which means ye'achel acherim, that it's mutar b'ana to the exclusion of isur adna? What difference does it make if Noach would feed the animals, which are hefker, they're not his, he never made a kinyan on them, isur adna, he's allowed to do that? No. Hashem is telling him, you're not allowed to do that. Because just like if you own your own animal, you're not allowed to feed it bas b'cholav, v'menachai, because you'd be nene, because you're fulfilling your obligation to feed the animal. In the case of Noach, his obligation is to feed all the animals in the teva, and therefore the status of Isurei Adna would apply in this case. Again, just to show you the brilliance and the methodology of Rameir Simcha, he looks at a phrase in one pasuk and compares it to the same identical phrase in a different pasuk, in a different context of Tumas Ochlin, and he shows and he demonstrates why HaKadosh Baruch Hu dafka chose the same phrase here when he when he communicated with Noah. Now I'd like to fast forward to Perek Zayin, pasuk Aleph. Vayomer Hashem leNoach, bo ata v'chol beischa el ateva ki oscha ra'isi tzaddik lefonai b'dor hazeh. Now, it's very interesting because Parshas Noach opens up with a twofold description of Noach. He's called Tzaddik Tamim. Here, in this pasuk, he's called a Tzaddik. And the Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he addresses Noach, drops the ball on Tamim.
What verse is that?
Pasuk Aleph in Perek Zayin. So you're comparing the first pasuk in Noach to pasuk Aleph in Perek Zayin. So why is it that Hashem leaves out the word Tamim? Rashi says, Mixas shvacho shel Adam b'fanav. The original pasuk at the beginning of Parshas Noach was not addressed to Noach. When God addresses Noach, it's b'fanav, it's in his presence, Mixas shvacho. You don't tell all the great things. So therefore, Hashem drops Tamim and only calls him a tzaddik. Rameir Simcha sees something much more profound in the omission of the word Tamim. He says the following: man was created by God. He had not been given at this point any moral law. What was man's challenge? And especially at the time of Dar HaMabul. Ikar anisayin shel kol hanivram haya hahistapkus. Histapkus means to live a disciplined life, as opposed to a life of unbridled desire and hedonistic pleasure. Histapkus literally means to be satisfied with what you have, not to overreach. The second challenge was Kabbalas Marus Minoach Ubana. That since Noach and his children were chosen by God, They were the new leaders of the world. Now their challenge was to accept the authority of Noach Uban as the leaders of the generation. Now, the Meir Simcha addresses Noach. What was the great challenge of Noach? Nisayin shel Noach haya ha'amel ve'asavlanut lechalkel kol aminim hashonim lefnei lefi kalkalos lasos kirtzonom. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us that Noach was challenged to be able to tolerate all the animals. He worked very hard to feed them. Each min had its own, food that it had to be fed, its own time. It had these animals ate it in the morning, these in the afternoon, these in the evening. For lispol tardosim, and to actually carry the weight of all this work. Mashalo yeshua b'seichel. It's something that defies human comprehension. In a zoo, you have many, many people who are hired to feed the animals. But imagine one person who has responsibility to feed every single species on the face of the earth. Vitamim, as we saw earlier, Pirusho by Gemara, the Gemara Avodah Zarah that we mentioned at the outset, that Tamim is B'darkov, Tzaddik b'masav. Tamim B'darkov, Rashi says he was humble, he was an unav, he was a savlan, he was tolerant, he wouldn't get angry. And now perhaps we can understand why in this pasuk, where Hashem addresses Noach and tells him to go into the teva, and I will save you from the entire generation, because I see you as the tzaddik, not as a tamid. He says the following: Lachein, Yedias Hashem Yisbarach Eino Machriach HaBechira. God's knowledge, His foreknowledge, doesn't force us to make any choice. We still have freedom of choice. That's because God's knowledge and Himself are one and the same. It's not like our knowledge and ourselves. That's the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim and in also Hilchos Tshuva. Anyway, Yedias HaNivroim Machriach. But if, let's say, a human being would know what God knows, that would actually compel him to do what's known, and it would remove and undermine his freedom of choice. Lachen, im gila dover l'noach shu tamim, alo haisa yidiyasa machrachas habechira, vayamuchach al hasavlanut hayitera van venusa. Had God revealed to Noach at this time that he, in the teva, would manifest tmimus, that anivus that it takes, and then the whole challenge and the most critical, essential challenge of Noach would be gone, because Noach, once God reveals to a human being what's going to happen, meaning that Noach is going to show with flying colors that he is a tamim in terms of his relationship with the animals in the teva, that would mean that Noach would have no freedom of choice. So at the beginning of the parasha, when God is talking to the universe and he's proclaiming the greatness of Noach, then it's only a Dias Hashem. He knows that Noach is both a tzaddik and a tamid. But when God chooses Noach to go into the teva, now the challenge of Noach is what's going to happen in the teva. Lachein lo gila Hashem yisparach elav. God does not reveal to Noach that he is a tamid, because nishar al zeh b'bchiraso achavshi ma'hechrech v'lachein l'kach godlo ma'loso. In other words, he's going to say tzaddik lefanai. He's not going to mention that he's a tamid. Tzaddik lefanai means that your actions in the past have proven you to be a tzaddik, and therefore I'm going to spare you from the entire deluge. But to go ahead and call him a tamim, which is the challenge that Noach is about to face when he goes into the teva, God could not reveal that to Noach, because in doing so, Yedias HaNivroim Machriach, the knowledge of man, would actually force and compel man to make those decisions and live up to that knowledge as it will be fulfilled, as it will be implemented in reality. So Noach had to be denied this description as a tamim because he hadn't yet proven himself as a tamim, and he would be forced and compelled to do so, and he'd be robbed of his freedom of choice. Now, what we're seeing here, I'm just mentioning as a footnote, is one particular presentation of Rav Meir Simcha over and over again throughout the Meshech Chochmah. In many contexts, Rav Meir Simcha makes this distinction between Yedias Hashem, as long as it's only God who knows, that's not going to force me to do something. It doesn't rob me of my freedom of choice. But when a creature, a living being on this earth knows about the future, that is going to rob the freedom of choice. So again, as I say, we're only looking at a very small piece of the puzzle. Now I'd like you to fast forward to Perek Ches, Pasuk Chaf. Noah comes out of the Teva, and when the time is ripe, he brings karbanos. Vayiven Noach mizbeach l'Hashem. Noach builds an altar. Vayikach mikol beima Torah mikol ha'ofa Torah vayal olos b'mizbeach. So the carbon here is carbon olah. We'll see what the significance of that is hopefully soon. And then Vayorach Hashem esreach hanichoach, and God pledges not to bring a mouth. Rav Meir Simcha quote a medrash. The medrash in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov tells us what was this mizbeach that Noach brought the olos on. This was none other than the mizbeach hagadol in Yerushalayim. The first person to bring a carbon of that mizbeach was Adam Arishon. That's based on a pasuk in Tehillim, Vatitev Lashem b'shar parm, etc. So Adam Arishon, who's described in Perek Samach Tes of Tehillim as bringing a carbon on the Mizbeach, that Mizbeach was none other than the Mizbeach that ultimately will stand in Yerushalayim. On that very same Mizbeach, Noach is going to bring his olos. Says Rav Meir Simcha, Yitochen, that favorite word of ours, Yitochen, it's possible that Kan meaning already at this early stage in history, before the Mizbeach was built in Yerushalayim, Haya din Kedushas Beis HaMikdash. The Mizbeach already had the status of Kedushas Beis HaMikdash. And that's why the pasuk says, Vayorach Hashem esreach hanichoach, which is a pasuk that only applies in the Beis HaMikdash. There's no reach nichoach outside the Mikdash. On a bama, for example. Uvishum zeh afal gav d'ein mizbeach bebama, v'ein reach nichoach bebama. Now, a bama is never described as a mizbeach. It's just a very temporary place where you slaughter a carbon and bring it as a carbon. So it's not called a mizbeach. And not only that, a bama, which is outside of Yerushalayim, does not have the status of reach nichoach. But here we have both reach nichoach and we have the word mizbeach. How is that possible? The answer is this Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov in the Medrash Rabbah, who says that this mizbeach was the mizbeach hagol b'Yushalayim, and it already had a din this early in history of Kedushas Beis HaMikdash. Now, obviously, we're going to have to ask a number of questions here. What do you mean? Kedushas Beis HaMikdash was sanctified by David HaMelech, by Shlomo HaMelech. This is way before. There must be, in Rav Meir Simcha is not going to address this question, but there may be different dimensions of Kedushas Mikdash, one of which already expressed itself or materialized in this world with the Mizbeach of Adam, of Noach, that will ultimately be built in Yerushalayim. So there is some dimension of Kedushas Mikdash to this Mizbeach. Hence, there's Reach Nicha, and it's called a Mizbeach. And then you have to ask yourself the question, well, if the avoda of these karbanos of olos were brought on this mizbeach and it had a din of Beis HaMikdash, we need a kohen. So the Rav Meir Simcha says, "V'Noach haya kohen." Interesting. I've never heard that Noach was a kohen. Usually, I understand a kohen to be someone who comes from Shevet Levi. Now, Rabbi Simcha asks the following question. The shechit itself of a carbon doesn't require a kohen. Shechit ksher bizarre. And Noach was a kohen. Who needs Noach's status as a kohen to validate his shechita? He could have been a zar, a non-kohen, and the shechita would still be valid. Lachein kasav. This is how Reb Meir Simcha wants to answer the following question. The Torah says, "Vayal olos b'mizbeach." Why does it say "Vayal olos"? It could have said "Vayishchat olos b'mizbeach." The Torah wants to teach us that the avod of ha'alah, which means to place the carbon on top of the mizbeach, which is designated exclusively to a kohen, Noach performed that avodah. And the reason for that is because A, Noach was a kohen, B, the mizbeach that he built had a din of mizbeach shebirushalayim, and therefore there's reach nicha. So vayal olos b'mizbeach is indicative of the fact that Noach did the halah al gabi mizbeach. He brought the carbon on top of the mizbeach, not just to shech the carbon, because that could have been done by a zar. And in the Beis Hamikdash, we have halacha that we bring karbanos from bakar, from tzon. And here, in the case of Noach, he brought not only chaya, but he brought oath. Now, oath is not brought on the mizbeach. There's something called malika, and there's a process. But here, there's halah of an oath. Who can be drasham? The answer to this problem is the following: that lo trachti alecha lahavi min amidbar dak bakar v'tzon shein b'shuscha v'zeh tam shenesar chaya v'of lehakrova k'dei shelo yimsor nafsho adam nafsho lotzu tzayid lahavi lahavi karban midbar min harodfin. That the medrash of Chazal, which is Vayikra Rabbah, asking Tamei Mikra, why is it the Torah does not command us or mandate us to bring karbanos on the mizbeach from ophos and from chayos, only from bakar and tzon? And the Medrash suggests that the reason for this is because it's a great tircha, it's a sakana to go out into the desert and find these wild animals called chayos. And the Torah did not want man to have to put his life into danger. He'll take the domesticated animals in his backyard of bakar v'tzon, of sheep and duck and goats and the like, and that's what he'll bring on the mizbeach. And the ophos, that's a real challenge to catch your ophos, and you might have to glide through the air in order to shoot down the ophos. So therefore, Hashem said, don't bring the ophos. However, in the case of Noach, he had absolute access to all the animals. He didn't have to go and hunt them down. And therefore, the reason that normally the karbanos are limited to bakar v'tzon no longer applies. That reason no longer applies to Noach, and therefore Noach brought karbanos from every single min, including chayos and ophos. So it turns out that Noach himself, according to Reb Meir Simcha, had the status of a Kohen. Now, it occurs to me that a Kohen has to be Jewish. Would you agree with me about that? That's a pretty solid assumption. So is Noach Jewish? I would have said Noach is not Jewish. We'll talk about that a little later today, Mr. Shem. But it seems from this presentation of Reb Meir Simcha that Noach had the status of a Kohen and therefore ipso facto of a Yisrael. And that supports one philosophical school in Judaism that God's initial intention was to select and elect Noach to be the father of the Jewish nation. And in the original divine scheme, Shem, Cham, and Yafes, all three of them were meant to be the the beginnings of Klal Yisrael. But only afterwards, God made a decision that only one of those three sons would be chosen as the father of Klal Yisrael. And basically, the father of Klal Yisrael is Avraham Avinu, and certainly not Noach. You will find absolutely nowhere that Noach is considered our father as a Jewish nation. But that's only because at some point God decided to reject Noach. Perhaps Vayochel, Rashi says, Asatz Mochulin, in the whole episode of his getting drunk. I don't know exactly at what point HaKadosh Baruch Hu dropped the ball, according to Amir Simcha, but the initial plan and the program of HaKadosh Baruch Hu was that Noach would be the father of the selected Amma Nivchar, and he already had the status of a Kohen. Now, in my print, and I would love to know if anyone has a different print, there's nothing here in Perek Tes Pasuk Dalet. Do you have a print that has Perek Tes Pasuk Dalet? My print skips it. However, I have what's called Bari Lan, and in the Meshech Chochmah Bari Lan, he has for Perek Tes Pasuk Dalet, which, as I said, does not appear here in the text that I have. But I printed out from Ayah Bari Lan. I printed out from Ner Simcha on Pasuk Dalet. So let's open up to Perek Tes Pasuk Dalet. The Pasuk says, Ach basar benafsho domo lo sochelu. And Rashi tells us that from this Pasuk, we derive the Isur of Aver min Achai. Right? Because it says, basar benafsho lo sochelu. Nafsho means when it's still alive. Lo sochelu, you're not allowed to eat it. So that's the source for Aver min Achai. Now, let me share with you the insights of Reb Meir Simcha. Reb Meir Simcha quotes the Targum Yonasan ben Uziel, who says that Behemo shenishkata v'adayim mifarcheses, he says that Kodem Matan Torah also. Now, it's a very nice insight, and it has tremendous significance in halacha that a Noach is not allowed to eat from a mefarcheses, which means that the animal was already slaughtered, but it's still flopping around. Why? Because it's still considered in this pasuk to be benafsho. Benafsho means there is still a nefesh, even though, again, the animal is going to die instantly, but right now the animal. So if you would pluck a limb from the animal while it's still fluttering, that's called mefarcheses. So Targum Yonasan says that that would be a violation of this pasuk, Ach basar benafsho domo lo sochelu. So Reb Meir Simcha wants to find a source in the Torah, some sort of text that perhaps would prove this thesis of Targum Yonasan ben Uziel. In order to do so, Reb Meir Simcha opens up a pasuk in the 12th perek of Dvarim Yud Beis pasuk Chaf Gimel. I'll read to you the pasuk. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is, as I read the pasuk, keep your finger here on the place in Parshas Tes pasuk Dalet, and we'll do a comparative. This is so typical of Reb Meir Simcha. There it says, "Velos," and here the pasuk is addressing Yisrael. Lo sochal hanefesh im habasar. We don't have the phrase basar benafsho that appears here in Noach, but rather in Parshas Re'eh, what we have is im habasar. So of course, Rabbi Simcha wants to know, why did the Torah use two different languages? So Meir Simcha points out an amazing chiddush of the Mishnah Melech. You know, the Mishnah Melech, Rav Yaakov Rosnas wrote a tremendous work on Chumash. It's called the Parshas Drachim. And in the Parshas Drachim, amongst many other things, Rav Rosnas, the Baal HaMishnah Melech, wants to understand Yosef accused his brothers of eating Avram and Achai. That's what Rashi says at the beginning of the Parsha Mechiras Yosef Hayeh. And the Meshech wants to understand, how could it be that the Shivtei Ka were guilty of this crime of eating Avram and Achai? Something that's so basic, it's also to Ben Noach. And Rav Yaakov Rosnas wants to understand that if, in fact, the brothers were not guilty of Avram and Achai, so Yosef was just fabricating a story. And the Parshas Chochmah comes up with an amazing chiddush. He says they were eating Avram and Achai, but they weren't eating Avram and Achai. Why? Yosef caught them eating Avram minam farcheses. The animal was still alive. And here's the machlokas between the brothers and Yosef. The brothers felt that they had a din of Yisrael. And Yosef said they had a din of Ben Noach. Ben Noach, as we saw in Reb Targum Yonas and Ben Oziel, it's also Sugin Sanhedrin on Daf Nun Ches, is enjoined from eating mefarcheses. And therefore Yosef caught them on a hot, caught them al cham, as we say in Hebrew. And they were violating the Yisrael from Nachai because they were eating Aver Minam Farcheses, which is also to Ben Noach. They held that they had a din of Ben Yisrael because Yaakov Avinu already was the beginning of Klal Yisrael, and a Yisrael is allowed to eat from him Farcheses. Comes along Rabbi Simcha, and he says, now I understand the difference between the two psukim. Our pasuk does not say im habasar, but rather our pasuk says basar bin nafsha. So instead of the im, ayin mem, in our pasuk, which addresses Ben Noach, you have the bays of bin nafsha. What's the difference between bin nafsha and im nafsha? So Meir Simcha quotes the Gaon. The Gaon says that the word im throughout the Tanakh refers to a close connection. Im is a bond. In the case of Klal Yisrael, the Easter is only applicable when it's hanefesh im habasar. And there's a tight bond here between the nefesh and the flesh, the life, vital, and the flesh. When is it im habasar? When the animal is walking on all fours and healthy. But once you shech the animal, it's no longer im habasar. The nefesh is not im habasar. The bond between the nefesh and the basar has already been severed. And it's a matter of seconds. The animal may be fluttering. But in the case of Ben Noach, here in our pasuk, it doesn't say im habasar, but rather it says binafsho. Binafsho means that the basar is somewhat related to the nefesh. And since it's mefarcheses, it's still related to the nefesh. Another example of Rabbi Simcha finding a source in the Torah for rabbinic distinctions, meaning for Chazal and Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now I see we're running tight on time, so I have a whole bunch of choices here. Let's see which one. All right, so I'll just mention, but we're going to look at Tes Pasuk Vav. But if you can, just take a quick peruse at Tes, Pasuk Tes, and Pasuk Yud. Ini mikim es brisi mikol yotze ateva. Very fascinating that God blesses the Yotzei HaTeva with the blessing of Pruruvu. And this is indicated by God's mandate to Noach that you should bring into the Teva Lahachios Zera. That's at the beginning of Perek Zayin, Pasuk Gimel. So again, in Zayin Gimel, God says Lahachios Zera. Zera is related to Pirya V'Riv. Says Rabbi Simcha, what animals or what creatures were brought into the Teva? Only those that are Lahachios Zera, meaning those that are born and generated through Pirya V'Riv. There are others that are noladim in a ipush and in a ashpos. Again, this is a long discussion. We don't have time for it now, but there are all sorts of bugs and small creatures that are generated not from Pirya V'Riv. They were not brought into the Teva. Yet, they survived the Mabul. Very fascinating. And Rabbi Simcha says that when the Torah describes the animals that go out of the Teva, and it says, it's only the Yotzei HaTeva that went into the Teva, which is Lachios Zera, which is Misha Nolad Mipir V'Rivyon, is going to get the Bracha Pruruvu. But the other creatures of Noladim Mina Ipush Mina Ashpos, they were not brought into the Teva. And they weren't included in the bris that HaKadosh Baruch Hu established with Noach and the Yotzei HaTeva. And he explains this based on the Rambam in Mor Nevuchim. The Rambam says in Mor Nevuchim that those creatures that are called Ashpa and Ipush, Eino Mechuvanim Shebiyitzira. They weren't really God's purpose in creation. God had to create them for other reasons. They needed, to somehow have an impact on the ecological system, on the Meshech Havir, and so forth and so on. And Rabbi Simcha wants to say that the reason why the Chachamim say that if you kill any of these species that are not Purim v'Rav, like Kinim and so forth on Shabbos, you're potter. And the reason for that is because if you take the neshama of any of these creatures that are not generated by Pirya V'Rivya, then you're not being pogan the Bria itself. It's not real Netilas neshama. Because the Rambam says that these were not the main purpose of God's creation. They were only created as a secondary thought in order to set up and perfect the ecological system. Okay. So now when God gives the bris that he won't destroy the earth, what about these creatures? So the answer is, the Torah says, God says, and if we would destroy these animals, these kind of creatures of Kinim and Ashpus and so forth, that would basically virtually mean that God would destroy the earth. So they had to be saved, even though they weren't in the table. Okay, I'm just mentioning that to you in passing. But in the next few minutes, I just want to point out to you in Perek Tes Pasuk Vav that it says, this is the second paragraph in that verse. It says Shofech Doma Adam, and then it says V'atem Pru Uravu. So the Torah starts with murder and the punishment for murder, and then it says Pru Uravu. So Rabbi Simcha wants to explain the relationship between the beginning of this pasuk and the end of the pasuk. And he based himself on a Gemara in Baba Basra Daf Samach. And the Gemara says that after the Churban Abayis, when there was such terrible Xeros, Kashos, Veros, and that the Romans and others were trying to undermine our Torah mitzvahs, Jewish people at that point should have decided that we're not going to propagate the species. We're not going to have children. Why should we bring children into the world that are going to suffer so much and that are going to be removed from Torah mitzvahs? And therefore, the Gemara says that if that gzera would have been accepted, that we now have to cease having children and we cannot be married to our wives, that would be a gzera she'enat tzibur yichol lamod bo. That would be too much for the Jewish people. So it's only like there was a heter, so to speak, a kvetch, to allow us to continue having children even after the Churban Habayis. And therefore, Yirmiyahu Hanavi says to the people of Israel that they have to get married and have children. And that pasuk is Klu lachem nashim v'olidu banim in the 29th chapter of the book of Jeremiah. Meaning, even after all the Xeros and the Golios and the terrible persecutions and religious persecution, nevertheless, marry and have children. And that's the mitzvah peri v'rivia. So now, says Rameir Simcha, let's read the pasuk. Shofech Adam bi Adam, Damo Yishofech. God says to the people of Israel that those murderers, Anochi Ejosh es Nefesh es Nafsha, leave it to me, says God. I'll have to deal with those murderers. That's my problem. I'll have to see that justice and punishment is meted out to them. But you, Atem Puravu. Despite the fact that there's so much murder, God says, you still are commanded Puravu. And that's really the basis for what Yirmiyahu tells the people of Israel, Kulachem Nashim Veholidu Bon. Now, Rabosai, I need your attention for just 1 minute. I would like to propose a possibility that would help me also with my Daf Yomi Shir, not today, I'm talking for next week, that we would get together a half hour earlier, and that means instead of 10:30, we start at 10 and finish at 11, and then I could do my Daf Yomi Shir perhaps at 11 o'clock instead of 11:45 or whatever it is on the schedule now. So I just need to know if you can show me. All I see on the screen, and this bothers me tremendously, I'm going to repeat this over and over again. I don't see faces. I just see a blank. It's very hard to teach. I wish you would try it yourself. Try to teach a class where you can't have eye contact with anyone. It's horrible. And this is the most difficult. Yeah, I had Corona, but this is much more difficult than Corona. So if you could tell me, I know the Gershon said it's okay. Chaim, you said it's okay. I checked it out with Aaron Goldscheider, and he said it's okay. Now I want to ask Raz and ask Jerry, and then fine. I want to ask Daniel Pfeffer.
10 o'clock, fine.
So that's what we want to do. We want to start, I'll send out a notice that we want to start the shir at 10, finish at 11, and then I go to Daf Yomi so we can finish Daf Yomi a little bit earlier than what we're going to do today. So if anyone has an objection and it can't work out, please, I beg you, let me know. You have my email address, my WhatsApp address, whatever you need, let me know. Otherwise, I think I'm going to go full steam forward. I just have to double check with David Plotsky. And if he's okay, then all systems go. All right, then? So I'm going to close this down, and immediately I'm going to give my Daf Yomi Shir on in a different meeting. So let me wish you all a great Shabbat Shalom.